explanation. Welcome back to Global Current Lens, where headlines are decoded, strategies are exposed, and the truth about global events comes into focus. This week, America stands once again on the edge of a constitutional standoff. Former President Donald Trump has publicly warned that, if re-elected, he might invoke the Insurrection Act to quell what he describes as chaos and lawlessness in the country. His statement has sent a shockwave through Washington, drawing fierce responses from Democratic leaders, constitutional scholars, and even some within his own party. Explanation: the debate isn't just about politics, it's about power, how far a U.S. president can go when claiming to protect national order. Quick context snapshot. To understand the magnitude of Trump's warning, it's important to recall what the Insurrection Act actually is. Passed in 1807, it grants the president authority to deploy military forces on U.S. soil in times of rebellion, unrest, or when state authorities fail to maintain order. This has been invoked only a handful of times in American history, most notably during the Civil Rights era and the Los Angeles riots in 1992. Explanation: for Trump to bring it up now, in the middle of a heated campaign season, reopens deep fears about the erosion of democratic norms and civilian control of the military. His words didn't come in a policy briefing or a legal memo. They came during a rally amplified by cameras, explanation, and cheered by supporters who believe America has fallen into disorder. Democrats quickly denounced the statement as a threat to democracy. Explanation: some warned it could pave the way for authoritarian governance if implemented. Explanation: but Trump's camp argues he's simply vowing to restore law and order, a message that resonates strongly with parts of the electorate disillusioned by rising crime rates, migrant surges, and political polarization. The question now is, explanation: what would it actually mean for the United States if a president invoked the Insurrection Act against domestic dissent? And how far could such power extend before it crosses into uncharted and possibly unconstitutional territory? The immediate event, Trump's comments about the Insurrection Act, came during a rally in Michigan, one of the battleground states that could determine the outcome of the 2024 election. Speaking before a crowd waving American flags and campaign banners, he declared, "If they riot again, we're not going to stand back this time. The next time, explanation, we'll use the powers we have. The Insurrection Act is there for a reason." The line drew thunderous applause. But beyond the roar of the crowd, explanation, the implications were chilling for many political observers, seemed to suggest that Trump anticipates, or perhaps expects, civil unrest around the next election, explanation, and that he's prepared to meet it not with police or National Guard coordination through governors, but with direct federal military intervention. Almost immediately, Democratic leaders responded. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer called the remark a dangerous echo of autocratic regimes, while House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries accused Trump of openly threatening to turn the U.S. military against its own citizens. President Biden, in a more measured tone, said that no American president should ever view the armed forces as a domestic police force. His administration emphasized that military deployment inside U.S. borders must always remain a last resort under strict constitutional limits. Meanwhile, experts rushed to television studios and online forums to parse Trump's words. The Insurrection Act, while legal, explanation, sits at the intersection of executive power and civil liberty. Explanation: invoking it doesn't require congressional approval. Only a presidential declaration that unlawful obstructions make it impossible to enforce the law through ordinary means. This could allow a president to send active duty troops into cities, overriding governors and local officials. The last president to consider doing so was Trump himself in 2020 during the George Floyd protests, when some cities saw looting and clashes between demonstrators and police. Back then, Trump's own defense secretary, Mark Esper, opposed the move, explanation, warning it would militarize a domestic crisis and set a dangerous precedent. Now, in 2025, the idea has returned. Only this time, Trump is promising it openly. His campaign spokesperson later tried to soften the rhetoric, saying Trump was simply restating his commitment to protect American lives. But the tone of the rally, the context of the statement, explanation, and the timing have sparked a fierce national conversation. Is this about safety or control? Explanation. Historical and political context. To grasp the full weight of Trump's warning, we must look at the historical shadow of the Insurrection Act. It was signed by President Thomas Jefferson in 1807, at a time when the United States was still defining how federal authority should interact with state sovereignty. Explanation. The law's language is broad, perhaps intentionally so, granting the president latitude to act whenever the laws of the United States are opposed by combinations too powerful to be suppressed by ordinary judicial proceedings. Over the centuries, it has been invoked sparingly, often under extreme circumstances. In 1861, President Abraham Lincoln relied on similar powers to confront the Confederate rebellion. In 1957, President Eisenhower used it to enforce school desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas, sending federal troops to protect 9 black students entering a previously all-white high school. In 1967, Lyndon Johnson used it to quell riots in Detroit. And in 1992, President George H.W. Bush invoked it after the acquittal of the officers in the Rodney King case led to days of violence in Los Angeles. Each of those moments shared one thing: the breakdown of local control. Governors either requested help or failed to restore order, and the federal government stepped in to prevent further chaos. Trump's 2025 threat sits in a vastly different political landscape, is not currently facing large-scale insurrection or widespread violence. Instead, what exists is deep political fragmentation, a clash of ideologies, explanation, social unrest simmering in pockets, and distrust between the federal government and several state administrations. Explanation. This context matters because it changes the nature of what insurrection means. If a president defines dissent, protest, or political opposition as disorder, explanation, the scope of executive power could expand dramatically. The concern among Democrats and constitutional scholars is that Trump might use the law preemptively or reactively. Political observers note that Trump's rhetoric, framing his opponents as enemies within, mirrors language used historically to justify emergency powers. The line between legitimate security action and authoritarian impulse becomes perilously thin when power is concentrated in the executive branch without clear judicial or congressional checks. Explanation. At the same time, Trump's supporters argue that such fears are exaggerated. They view his statement as part of a long-standing conservative narrative emphasizing law and order, particularly after years of social unrest, border crises, and growing frustration with crime in major cities. To them, invoking the Insurrection Act is not tyranny, it's leadership. Thus, some explanation, the clash isn't just about legality, it's about competing visions of America, one that prioritizes individual liberty and protest, and another that demands decisive control to preserve stability. Global reactions internationally. Trump's comments have not gone unnoticed. Outlets in Europe and Asia carried the story with headlines framing it as a sign of growing political volatility in the United States. Foreign governments, particularly U.S. allies, are watching closely. In Brussels, EU officials expressed private concern about democratic backsliding in the U.S., a term they've used in reference to other countries where populist leaders have blurred the line between civilian and military power. One senior diplomat told Reuters that if America normalizes military involvement in domestic politics, it sends a signal the world does not need. In London, analysts compared the rhetoric to the early days of the Patriot Act debate after 9/11, when civil liberties collided with national security priorities. The Financial Times ran an editorial noting that the invocation of the Insurrection Act could shake investor confidence and international faith in American stability. Russia, meanwhile, responded predictably. Kremlin spokespersons mocked the situation that Washington lectures others on democracy while preparing to send tanks into its own cities. Chinese state media outlets, particularly Global Times, used the moment to underscore what they called the hypocrisy of U.S. human rights rhetoric. For America's rivals, the optics are clear. Explanation. Internal division equals strategic opportunity. When a nation's military might becomes entangled in domestic politics, its global posture weakens. Allies hesitate. Adversaries test boundaries. The power of example, America's moral leverage erodes. Inside the Pentagon, the reaction has been more cautious. And current and former military officials, speaking anonymously to major outlets, have voiced discomfort with Trump's remarks. The U.S. military prides itself on civilian control and political neutrality, a doctrine reinforced since World War II. Explanation. If the Insurrection Act were invoked for political purposes, it could fracture that delicate balance, creating internal friction between senior officers and civilian leadership, even among Trump's conservative allies abroad, such as certain populist movements in Europe. The rhetoric is being received with hesitation. Many right-wing parties, while ideologically aligned with Trump on nationalism and immigration, are wary of legitimizing overt military power in domestic affairs. Explanation: in essence, the world is watching America not as the arbiter of democracy, but as a case study in its fragility. Economic and strategic stakes. Beneath the political drama lies an economic reality that could prove even more consequential. The markets thrive on predictability, and few things unsettle investors more than the prospect of military intervention on U.S. soil. If serious discussions about invoking the Insurrection Act continue, even hypothetically, economists warn of market volatility. In such a scenario, investor confidence could waver, foreign capital might retreat, and safe haven assets like gold and treasury bonds could surge. The dollar, long seen as the world's most stable currency, might experience fluctuations driven not by economic fundamentals but by political fear. At home, the uncertainty could deepen consumer anxiety. The U.S. economy has weathered inflationary pressure, rising debt, and slowing job growth. Explanation: any perception of looming internal unrest could depress spending, reduce hiring, and chill small business optimism, especially in politically sensitive states. From a strategic standpoint, the implications are broader. Explanation: America's global deterrence depends not only on its military capability but on the perception of domestic unity and political stability. When the world's largest democracy appears internally fractured, its leverage in negotiations, from trade talks to defense alliances, diminishes. Explanation: foreign adversaries understand this dynamic. Russia and China, in particular, may see a divided America as an opening to expand in regions like Eastern Europe, Africa, and the South China Sea. A U.S. explanation: President invoking military power against domestic dissent could weaken Washington's moral standing in future diplomatic disputes, especially when condemning other governments for human rights abuses or state crackdowns. Explanation: there's also a legal economic dimension. The invocation of the Insurrection Act could trigger challenges that delay or disrupt federal programs, aid disbursement, explanation, and contracts, depending on which areas are deemed on rebellion or under military control. Legal scholars warn that the consequences would ripple through everything from transportation networks to social services. In short, Trump's statement was political in nature. Its potential outcomes stretch into economics, defense, and governance. It exposes a paradox. The very law designed to protect national security could, if used recklessly, undermine it. Possible futures: the path ahead for the United States now branches into three broad scenarios, each shaped by political calculation, public response, and institutional resilience. Scenario 1: de-escalation. In this future, Trump's remarks remain rhetoric, a strategic appeal to his base rather than a genuine plan of action. Democratic leaders continue to denounce the threat, but public attention shifts back to the campaign trail. The military distances itself from political discourse, reaffirming its commitment to neutrality. The election proceeds amid tension but without major unrest. If Trump wins, legal advisors and senior military figures might persuade him not to invoke the act, reminding him of the backlash that could follow. The Republic survives another storm, battered but intact. Scenario 2: limited conflict. In this middle path, does erupt following the election, perhaps localized protests, sporadic violence, or politically motivated riots. The new administration, facing pressure from both supporters and critics, decides to partially invoke the Insurrection Act in specific regions. Explanation: federal troops are deployed to assist local law enforcement, ostensibly to protect infrastructure and quell violence. While the move is legally defensible, it sparks outrage from opposition leaders, civil rights groups, and international observers. The courts become battlegrounds for defining presidential power. Explanation: the political environment remains tense, but institutions, courts, Congress, media continue to function, restraining the extremes of executive authority. Scenario 3: escalation. The darkest path begins with chaos, either perceived or real. Widespread protests, misinformation, and civil unrest provide the pretext for a full invocation of the Insurrection Act. Federal troops patrol U.S. streets. Governor's authority is sidelined. Explanation: civil liberties are restricted under the guise of national order. The judiciary, overwhelmed and divided, struggles to respond quickly. Congress faces paralysis as partisan divides deepen. International confidence in U.S. democracy collapses, sparking economic downturns and diplomatic fallout. In this grim scenario, America enters a constitutional crisis, one that tests the limits of its founding principles. Explanation: the question becomes not whether the Insurrection Act was legal, but whether the Republic itself remains recognizable. Each of these futures depends on a delicate equation: political restraint, institutional independence, and public awareness. Explanation: the danger lies not just in what one man might do, but in how a nation chooses to react. Tension, peak, and big question. The Insurrection Act has always been a paradox, a tool meant to preserve democracy, yet capable of endangering it. With some explanation, the same legal mechanism that protected black students in Little Rock could, under different leadership, be used to silence dissent in Portland or Philadelphia. Nation. America's founders designed a system built on checks and balances, but they also relied on something far less tangible: restraint. The Constitution assumes good faith among those who wield power. When that faith erodes, no clause, no statute, no law can fully protect liberty. Trump's warning has reignited a fundamental question: is America still capable of trusting its leaders to act within constitutional limits? Or has politics become a sum contest where every legal lever is fair game? The real crisis may not be military, it may be moral. For nation, it's about whether a nation founded on the rule of law can resist the temptation to use law as a weapon. Explanation: the clash over Trump's Insurrection Act threat is more than a political fight, it's a test of America's democratic immune system. The strength of a republic isn't measured by how loud its leaders shout, but by how calmly its institutions hold. History shows that democracies rarely collapse overnight. They erode in moments like these, when fear justifies force, when rhetoric becomes reality, explanation, and when citizens begin to accept that extraordinary powers are necessary to preserve ordinary peace. Explanation: whether Trump's statement proves to be campaign bravado or a genuine warning, it has reopened one of the most important conversations in American life. Explanation: how much power should any president hold in the name of security? As the campaign season unfolds and tempers flare, explanation: the world will be watching not just to see who wins, but to see what kind of democracy America chooses to be. Stay with Global Current Lens for continuous analysis. Explanation: where every headline meets its context and every claim meets its history. Explanation: because understanding the world means more than hearing the noise, it means cutting through it.